We're going to turn our attention now south of the border, where there's little more than a week until Americans head to the polls. During this campaign, both candidates have teased they could reopen trade talks with Canada if elected. The USMCA, the trilateral trade deal between Canada, the U.S. and Mexico, as it now stands, comes up for review in 2026, giving each country the chance to say whether they want to extend the agreement or rehash it. Republican candidate and former President Donald Trump made his view clear at a rally earlier this month. Take a listen.
That upon taking office, I will formally notify Mexico and Canada of my intention to invoke the 6-year renegotiation provisions of the USMCA, and it's coming due very soon. Oh, I'm going to have a lot of fun.
Democratic candidate and Vice President Kamala Harris, meanwhile, still hasn't said whether she'll reopen talks, but did post to social media last month that she was one of only 10 senators to oppose the deal, and she plans to make use of the review process. So what does all that mean for Canada? With me now to talk about exactly that are former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, and former Canadian Ambassador to the U.S., Frank McKenna. Hello to both of you. It's really nice to see you. I appreciate you making the time for the discussion. Mr. McKenna, in your view, I mean, you've been through a lot of different U.S. elections. How significant do you think this one will be?
I can't think of any that would be more consequential for Canada. Again, it's important to note that we don't have a right to choose the President of the United States in Canada. We do respect their choice. It's a very robust democracy. It's highly consequential for us because of the trade potential disruption, and also because of the potential for major movement on immigration. If a mass deportation takes place, it'll influence us. And quite frankly, if there's any attack on multilateral instruments around the world, whether it's the Paris Environmental Accords or whether it's the WTO or NATO, all of those are very consequential to a country like Canada. So, yeah, my view is this election, I find it hard to remember an election that would be more significant than this one.
Ambassador Heyman, you're very familiar with the Canadian context, having spent a number of years here, and all of the items that Mr. McKenna so rightly just pointed out. In your view, has there been a more significant American election for Canada?
Probably not even close. You know, we have always been friends, neighbors, allies, and even had small differences. But since World War II, we've both been on the world stage promoting liberal democracy. That's small l, small d democracy around the world. You know, freedom of speech, the right to vote, and all of the things that go with a liberal democracy. And they would be under really assault with an autocratic presidency coming out of Donald Trump, which would complicate the Canada-U.S. relationship, and that's putting it mildly. I think Frank's points are absolutely spot on with regard to tariffs and immigration. And one thing I'd like to add, though, yes, he's right that Canada can't influence our election, and Canadians shouldn't be involved in it. But Americans living in Canada may actually be the swing factor here. And if you haven't voted, Americans, you better go to votefromabroad.org and do it right now, because these elections over the last 8 years have been very, very tight, and this one is likely to be even closer.
What's your sense, Mr. McKenna, of where NAFTA stands insofar as that review coming up in 2026? We outlined, you know, Mr. Trump, as you mentioned, is threatening a tariff, a 10% tariff writ large on all imports. But beyond that, he made NAFTA a talking point in a rally he held in Detroit a number of weeks ago. He's viewing 2026 as an opportunity to renegotiate the entire thing. How ready should our federal government be for the possibility of that?
Well, they should be very ready, and they are. They've got a war room working full-time on this. You've got people across the country and provincial governments working on it as well, as is civil society. So, and I think it'll be a nonpartisan effort by Canada. It'll be Canada Inc. But make no mistake, Trump has made it clear at rallies, but also in an editorial meeting that he had with the Wall Street Journal, that in his view tariffs were going to be imposed, and that would include nearshore countries as well. So I don't think there's any doubt that we should assume he's going to do what he says he's going to do. And by the way, I'm going to say this quickly. I would worry about both symmetrical threats and asymmetrical. By symmetrical, I mean reopening NAFTA, for example. Even though NAFTA technically will exist to 2036, certainly there would be an effort to try to renegotiate each year going up to 2036. But the asymmetrical threats worry me a lot, and those would be based on national security or other U.S. interests to put tariffs against steel, aluminum, other commodity groups, wreaking havoc really with trade patterns and inviting retaliation from around the world. All of that would be very consequential. And by the way, the 10% to 20% tariffs he talks about putting up around America, he's not making it clear that he would respect the treaty rights that we have under NAFTA, Mexico and Canada. And so we may have to fight that battle out in the courts as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very salient point. I remember being at the RNC and asking many of his delegates there if, in fact, Canada, would be exempt or those rights would be respected, and they did not have a specific answer. They did not say yes, they would be. That's for sure. Ambassador Heyman, on the trade front, certainly, there's not even close to the language being employed by the Democratic nominee, but she is someone who did, as we pointed out in the introduction, vote against NAFTA. She had concerns about how far it did not go, I guess, in her view, on issues around climate, for example. What should a federal government expect if Kamala Harris is the president in that vein?
I think there will be a serious look at the review period in 2026, which is built into the agreement. And that review process, as you mentioned, will tackle some of the things that she was concerned about that caused her not to vote for it. But there were a lot of Democrats that voted for this agreement, including Nancy Pelosi and the efforts that she put forth in the House. And there were great expectations that Mexico would follow certain sets of rules with regard to labor standards, environmental standards, and more. And it appears that they may not be meeting the level of standards that were built into the agreement. So it may be that even if the vice president becomes president, that this agreement may have to be amended, or she may not sign on to it, and it may fall into the category that Frank talked about, that it just goes through this annual review period for another decade. But I think that issue would be a Mexican issue. With regard to Donald Trump, if he puts tariffs across the board on everything, I don't know what a free trade agreement looks like when you have tariffs imposed. Mm-hmm. And so it may be moot point on 2026. This agreement may be de facto not operational. And we could see a court battle, but I think he's used to court battles and dragging things out. And so I wouldn't take a lot of stock in going to court with this.
Mr. McKenna, go ahead, sir. You want to jump in?
Yeah. No, Mexico has become a real problem for the United States and for us, quite frankly, whether it's environmental standards, labor standards, or most importantly, being a halfway station for cheap Chinese imports into the United States. It's become a bit of a problem. And I think dealing with that complexity is just going to make the whole negotiation much more difficult. Because in some respects, Canada and the U.S. might be on the same side on some of the issues.
I'm going to follow up with a concluding question on a completely different subject, if you don't mind, Mr. McKenna, only because you are well known within liberal circles in this country, and in particular, of course, your time serving Atlantic Canada. And there are a lot of Atlantic Canadian MPs who this week told the Prime Minister they want him to step aside. Do you have a feeling one way or the other about whether or not Justin Trudeau should remain as leader of the party?
Yeah, I'm probably a bad person to ask, because I left exactly 10 years to the day. And when I go around New Brunswick now, I get more people saying, "Thanks for leaving, Frank," than I do, "Thanks for what you did when you were in there." There seems to be a lot of support for the idea people would leave. Look, I understand. I really respect what MPs are going through. It's really turmoil between self-preservation and loyalty, and one has to respect the fact that people are loyal to the leader. If it were me, I would be leaving, simply because 10 years, I think, is a natural life expectancy of every commodity we have, from a watch to a phone, even to a political even to a political term. And we're watching now incumbency become a major factor in elections in BC and New Brunswick, UK and France and Germany. It's hard. And I think if Trudeau were to leave, if he were to stay, well, then he'll fight a valiant battle. But if he were to leave, like Mulroney, I think there would be a lot of praise for the record that he accumulated while he was in office, and I think history would be very kind to him. It's certainly if things continue the way they are, it's going to be a bit messy. But I just want to make it clear, I have a lot of respect for what MPs are going through right now. They're watching the cognitive dissonance that they're experiencing just tells us that these are just good people trying to find their way through a very difficult situation.
I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate both of you making the time, as always, for the discussion and for the perspective today. Former Ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, and former Ambassador to the U.S., Frank McKenna.